Hey everybody, happy Saturday and welcome to another edition of Sports Speak. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Episode 57, actually it'll be a 1-year anniversary from our very first episode on Tuesday. So thank you to everybody who's supported us along the way. It's been great that we've been able to continue doing this show here on the Zoom platform for this past year and bring some sports opinions and knowledge out to you over YouTube. But there's a lot to get to today, a lot of interesting topics of discussion. We're going to be talking MLB, NBA, also talking a little tennis, the Naomi Osaka saga regarding her withdrawing from the Open after drawing criticism for not wanting to speak with the media. We'll discuss that. We'll also be talking a little NASCAR and previewing the SRX Superstar Racing Experience first race tonight on CBS at Stafford Speedway. But before we get into all that, of course, we have to do our SEC of the week. So I'll start. I'm going to go with my surprise. And in some ways, it's really not much of a surprise. But Jacob deGrom just keeps defying what we see from him. I mean, everybody knows he's a master of his craft, one of, if not the best pitcher in baseball, one of, if not the best player in baseball. But last night against the San Diego Padres, he took it to an entire another level. 10 strikeouts, including 2 of Fernando Tatis Jr., allowed just 1 hit over 6 innings. And at the plate, big 2-run single in the 5th inning, helping to give some run support to himself to win the game 3-2. And some of the statistics for him are just mind-boggling at this point. He has only allowed 4 earned runs on the mound in 10 starts this season. And at the same time, he has 5 RBI. So he's driven in more at the plate than he's allowed on the mound. And there's only 2 other pitchers in history who have ever done that over a 50-plus inning stretch. And both of them were two-way players, Babe Ruth and Shohei Ohtani. Jacob deGrom is not only one of the best pitchers, but one of the best hitting pitchers and one of the best fielding pitchers, and that's what makes him so great. Of course, the little injury scares on occasion always become nerve-wracking. He did leave last night's start at 80 pitches, did not go out for the 7th inning due to tightness in his flexor in his right arm, which some people were a little scared about, but deGrom and Mets manager Luis Rojas both said that it's not something they're really worried about. They think Jacob deGrom was explaining that he does a lot of ligament tests, and he did have Tommy John surgery back in the day, right after he had transitioned from shortstop to pitcher. And he said that this doesn't feel anything like that. So, and he said it didn't really get worse as the game went on, and he feels like he fully expects he can make his next start. But the Mets definitely depend on him, and he was big last night as they took down the Padres. Now, my expectation is the Denver Nuggets faltering in the postseason. With no Jamal Murray, I really didn't see a way that this team could really succeed, especially against a Phoenix Suns team with veteran leadership in Chris Paul, a really good coach in Monty Williams, and of course, a great group of young talent with Booker, Ayton, Bridges, and others. And the Nuggets are down 3-0. Jokic won MVP. And he's still playing at an MVP level, but it's just he does not have that much of a supporting cast. And if Denver really wants to become a future powerhouse in the Western Conference, you need to surround Jokic with other wing players. They do not have a great wing shooter. They do not have a great wing defender either. This team really goes through Murray and Jokic, and with no Murray, it's really just Nikola Jokic having to go up against a talented Phoenix team. So not surprised that they're currently down 3-0 and 1 defeat away from being bounced from the postseason. And in conclusion, college football has rumored that the college football playoff will be expanding to 12 teams in 2023. I am so happy about this move. I think we've talked about this on the show a while back. I just think it's ridiculous having it just down to 4 teams, causes a lot of drama. It doesn't give room for a potential surprise like a UCF or a Coastal Carolina from a smaller conference for us to at least see what they can do. Because thinking about Central Florida a couple years ago, they get into a New Year's Six bowl and they blow out Auburn. So what could they have done if they had given the opportunity to play in the playoff against some of the other football powerhouses from, of course, more celebrated conferences? But I think this move is great and creates a better balance of power in collegiate football.
Yeah, I have to agree. And actually, I guess I'll start with my C because that was going to be it right there, was the fact that college football is making this change. And, let's be honest, Eddie, when we brought up this conversation maybe about 6 months ago, we truthfully thought the NCAA wouldn't necessarily consider something like this, considering in the past that, well, they don't really listen to anything. But the fact that they're making this switch is essentially a must, in my opinion. I mean, not just because of the fact that the fans are complaining, but I truthfully think that for a while we've lacked, I don't want to say a true national champion because we've had a true national champion, but we haven't had like a true system because everything's based upon, how good of opponents you play, or the fact of, all right, well, if you have one loss, well, we look at the schedule and if your team's good enough, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt over, performing team, or I should say overperforming teams, but an underperforming conference. Like teams like Boise State, for example, years ago would have benefited from this, being very strong in the Mountain West Conference, but not really, playing other teams. You mentioned UCF. They would really benefit from something like this with the past years they had. And of course, recently this year with other teams finding ways to be successful despite not having a good conference, it was about time NCAA made a change. And again, I'm really excited because the first year they brought the college football tournament in general, to me, it was one of the most exciting playoff tournaments in mankind when they first introduced it. But now the fact that you can expand it and make it even better, which means more games for everyone, I think everyone's going to love that and no one's going to be opposed to it. Even if the season goes slightly longer, I'm all okay for that. Let's not forget I'm the same person that wants to see 17 or 18 NFL games in a regular season because it feels so short. So this is definitely a great move for the NCAA. But I'll start with a surprise as well. And it's kind of interesting because you made it your expectation. Of course, I do have to agree that the Denver Nuggets were going to fall apart, and we all could have assumed that. But wouldn't you think at least at some point in the series, this team would have at least taken one game to the Phoenix Suns? I mean, there's been no purpose, absolutely no poise at all for this team. And the fact that they haven't even been close to Phoenix since opening tip-off, it to me is just outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous that this team's getting dominated every single time out there on the floor. Again, my expectation wasn't for them to win, but you could at least play a little bit better. I mean, this team isn't worse than Dallas, in my opinion. This team could be better than the Clippers, in my opinion. So for this team to just be completely dominated by Phoenix from start to finish, I just don't know. I feel like they could play a little bit better basketball and have the potential of at least taking one game away. But with how they're playing right now, they're going to get swept. And it's bad news for Denver again. Yes, Jamal Murray's hurt. That's one of your big shooting options. And of course, Jokic coming off MVP. That's, really, really good. But at the end of the day, I mean, after the progress you made last year, and again, I know injuries hold you back, but after the progress this team made last year and being the surprise through the playoffs, the fact that they're down 3-0 in a series, in a main series that is in a semifinal in the Western Conference, it just doesn't suit well. I feel like this team could have fought, a little bit more. I mean, even the New York Knicks won a playoff game. So anything can happen is all I'm saying. I mean, the Jazz lost to the Grizzlies, game one of the opening round. You could think this team can at least take one, but they're not. And the expectation, I'm just going to say it now. Who's your daddy? Garrett Cole coming out and turning around and having a great performance against the Minnesota Twins. I mean, come on now. If you didn't think he was going to be fired up after what Josh Donaldson said to the media, well, I'll tell you what, Garrett Cole dominated Donaldson, and Donaldson should probably never talk in a situation like that again unless he's positive he's going to back it up. He ended up getting struck out twice in that game from Garrett Cole in particular. 2 of 9, Garrett Cole, 2 of 9 of Garrett Cole's strikeouts, in which I believe he only went 6 innings eventually for that win. But I'll tell you what, too, I mean, for Cole, again, you can raise the questions of, oh, he's used substance and so on, to benefit his grip. And I mean, listen, at this point, every single pitcher has in baseball. So if you're going to pinpoint him and want him penalized, like Trevor Bauer, for example, I think we're at a point where just way too many players have used, different types of substances and so on to get a better control on the baseball. I mean, compared to the league-wide steroid issue, which of course is a massive, massive issue in the past, I don't see necessarily how you can suspend players in a scenario, because to me, at this point, if you suspend someone, you're just simply pinpointing. But if you thought Garrett Cole was only being successful just because of, a little bit of sticky on his fingers, you're definitely wrong. Sure, he's no Jacob deGrom, and I'll give you that. But the fact of the matter is, Garrett Cole's still a very dominant pitcher, and to turn around and absolutely dominate the Minnesota Twins, who have had an abysmal year, might I add, and thought we can, and well, at least I thought this team could be potentially competing for a borderline wild card spot. They have completely looked terrible from start to finish, and Josh Donaldson getting owned only even adds that even more.
Now, I am going to agree with you on the Garrett Cole aspect that, and same with Trevor Bauer, that regardless of whether they use substances or not, they're great pitchers. But if the MLB continues to just let this happen, because we're starting to get to a league, we already have talked about this before, where the pitching is starting to get a little too strong in comparison to the hitting. Some of that is because the baseballs aren't juiced as much as they were in past years. But if the MLB even had to go to those extenuating circumstances in the first place to try to give, the offense a shot here against these pitchers, it's clear that there's something that needs to be addressed, whether it's moving back the mound a foot. I know the Atlantic League, for example, is experimenting with that. There's other things you can try. And I feel like you got to still consider this in some ways. You can't, it's not as severe, obviously, as the steroid usage that we saw specifically in the 90s and the early 2000s. But I think there are a lot of pitchers. And if you look at the stats, if you look at spin rate, because that's what this is all about. It doesn't have to do with how fast you're throwing, because everybody can throw 100 miles an hour, because that's just the way you're taught to pitch. You're using more strength in your arm. That's why we're seeing more elbow issues now than you have in any other previous era of baseball for pitchers. But the spin rate, and you see this with Garrett Cole, with Trevor Bauer, there are other pitchers as well, where their curveballs, their sliders, they spin so much now, and you're getting that because you're getting better grip on the ball. And that all comes from the substances that you're putting on your hands. But the thing is, now, like I said, this isn't as severe. I don't think this is as egregious as actually taking drugs that are making you stronger, that can also have drastic effects on your body, that can cause you to break down. These foreign substances that these pitchers are using, they're not going to cause future health issues to them like the steroids potentially could. But that being said, if the MLB does nothing, they're just proving that they have weak leadership and can't do anything to try to keep control of their own players. And I really think that this is something you have to consider, and you can't just completely throw off to the side. The fact that Garrett Cole answered that question so awkwardly the other day about the spider tack, I mean, that's part of this as well. But it's just, I just feel like this is something that Major League Baseball has to try to address in some way. Now, doing these stupid like scoping these pitchers down between every inning, I mean, that gets ridiculous, because I was watching an interview on MLB Network where they were talking about this, and how awkward is that for a fan that like every inning you're going to have Joe West out there making sure that a pitcher doesn't have anything hidden, any substances, anything on their jersey or on a finger that they can just rub on their hand. Like that's awkward, but it's a tough spot for Major League Baseball to be in. They're in a lot of difficult situations right now. Addressing the DH, addressing the 7-inning rule, addressing pace of play. Add this to the list as well of something they need to try to take care of. But I want to shift gears to another postseason team that, like the Nuggets, is really performing poorly, and that's the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, I know they got through the first round, but we had both picked them to sweep Dallas. The Dallas Mavericks are not that good of a basketball team. Luka Doncic is excellent. The rest of that team, they do not have that much talent. You have a lot of guys that are kind of stowaways from old teams that haven't failed in other places, like Tim Hardaway Jr., who have been, good complementary pieces to Luka Doncic, but aren't stars. Kristaps Porzingis has struggled majorly since joining the Dallas Mavericks. The Clippers almost lost to a team that had Boban Marjanovic as their starting center. And now you go into this Utah series. And yes, you got to give credit to the Utah Jazz. Donovan Mitchell's playing out of his mind. Rudy Gobert proving why he's a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year. Joe Ingles playing really well as a shooter and also as a wing defender. But the Clippers, this is getting ridiculous at this point. It's not just the history, the curse of them not making it past the second round. I'm talking about this roster here and now. You have 2 superstars, Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. And the fact that you can't even make it to a conference finals, especially in a year where this is your year if you're the Los Angeles Clippers. The Lakers were injured. They're out. The Warriors were banged up. They're out. The 2 powerhouses of the Western Conference, not even in this anymore. You have 3 inexperienced teams. Your roster has more playoff experience than Phoenix, Denver, or Utah. You need to be able to take advantage of that. This is your year. And the Clippers did nothing to try to address the situation. You get rid of Doc Rivers after last year. Not saying that was a terrible move, but you replaced him with a coach who was only a coach in the NBA as a figurehead, so they had a coach, so LeBron James could basically call the shots when Cleveland won a championship. LeBron James won that championship for the Cavaliers, not Ty Lue's coaching. Ty Lue has not done much for the Clippers whatsoever as a coach. His schematics were not great. His rotations have been very strange in this series, specifically on the offensive side. And then, of course, general management as well, the front office, just letting Montrezl Harrell walk to your rival that plays in the same arena as you. And now you're reaping the punishment. And I mean, I feel like everybody just points out the issue with the Clippers is load management, that they rest Kawhi too much, they rest Paul George, but it's more than that. And it's embarrassing, quite frankly, for this team. Thinking about all these other quote unquote super teams that have had big threes, that have had dynamic duos, they've at least made it to a conference finals. The Thunder in the past, the Heat in the past, the Lakers, the Warriors, the Nets now are trending in that direction. I mean, it's insane to see a team like this. And you could excuse last year in a couple of ways, being in the bubble, for example, that was a difficult circumstance and took away all potential home court advantage. It was also the first year of Kawhi and Paul George being on the same team. It's the first time ever you have a dynamic duo of 2 guys who really play the same position. And you understand having to balance that out. Well, now you had a 72-game season to sort that out with them predominantly healthy, both of them, for most of the season. It's really no excuse at this point for the Clippers to be struggling as much as they are. Kudos to the Jazz, but the Clippers continuing to be a disappointment and play second fiddle in Los Angeles.
Yeah, typically I don't typically I don't agree with Stephen A. Smith. But he mentioned something yesterday that I thought was a very, very valid point, was that the production from both Paul George as well as Kawhi Leonard is not still equal enough to the production that we've seen from Donovan Mitchell throughout the first 2 games in this series. And I'm not talking about points, but overall the value being on the floor and the energy levels and so on. And again, we know Kawhi Leonard is a great basketball player when he's on the floor, no matter what. Paul George, same thing. But you can make a valid argument to say Paul George has not been playing well. In fact, I'll even go to this further point. I think Kennard's been arguably the best player the Clippers have had on the floor the entirety of this postseason, especially within these series throughout the first 2 games. I mean, he's been a lights-out shooter for that Clippers team. But the fact of the matter is this. When you have 2 superstars, 2 of them, and 1 player for the Utah Jazz is outperforming you, you're going to be in for a long series. It's just that simple. The Utah Jazz, granted, I'm still surprised this team is as successful as it is. And again, as a 1 seed, I didn't see them making it far, but now I truthfully do believe this team could make the NBA championship and could turn around to the NBA finals. Not saying they win. I'm still not on the board yet of saying they win, but this could be a team that could beat Phoenix and turn around and make it to the NBA finals and potentially put together a very good series. But again, the fact of the matter though is this Clippers team is a good team. But I also want to point out, Eddie, again, this is what happens when you get complacent as a roster. And I think the fact of the matter is this. We've talked about it multiple times, and I could pinpoint other teams in the NBA that have had the same problem. For example, the Dallas Mavericks, they make a trade for Kristaps Porzingis. They have no draft picks at all for a good little bit. The team, sure, I guess you could say you got Tim Hardaway, great addition. But other than that, what have the the Mavericks done to fully make their roster better? Or I'll pinpoint an even bigger team. Of course, the Lakers had their problems. We talked about that on last show, where this team's gotten only worse. So for them to lose, to me, is not a surprise. But they also got complacent after a championship. But how about the Portland Trailblazers? When's the last time the Trailblazers actually drafted a good player? I mean, granted, they're good every year, but you think you could at least find a 6th man in with a 20th draft pick or so on? Once that team actually had a bunch of new players that are actually genuinely good. But then you wonder why Damian Lillard wants out. Because that team, you could probably name at least 8 or 9 players that have been there throughout the last 5 seasons. That team's not going in the right direction. It's basically the same as what it was from last season. And same thing, for example, another team that was complacent and they got completely destroyed in the first round of the playoffs, the Boston Celtics. Granted, yes, okay, you lost Kyrie Irving a few years back to Brooklyn. You brought in Kemba Walker, but this team hasn't gotten better. It's been the same. It had one surprise run, and it had completely fallen apart. And I'm not going to lie, for Boston, a little bit surprised that Brad Stevens is going to be the man in charge. Not the fact that he's not the head coach, but put him in a big spot. That's a little bit of a surprise. But going back to the main point of the Clippers is that, you see, when you get complacent, lack of success is going to happen. And this team, they're the best. We're going to build a whole new place for this team because they're the best team in LA. Well, that may have gotten to your head just a little bit too much, in my opinion, because this team is not playing like last year. This team is nowhere near where it was last year. And it goes to compliment not just the Jazz, but the NBA in general. Teams get better. When teams make changes, teams try to make a difference, teams get better. How long did it take Phoenix to finally become a relevant basketball team for the first time since they lost Steve Nash? It took them a very, very long time. So the fact of the matter that Phoenix is back in basketball and has a purpose, at least in the Western Conference, to try to compete for a championship. And I also do want to make this one last point before I hand it off to you as well, Eddie, again. For at least the Western Conference, of course, Brooklyn's still the favorite. Once Brooklyn does get it done in the East, we could be looking at a bunch of teams looking for their first NBA championship, which is something massive. No team right now in the Western Conference remaining has ever won a championship. So with that being said, granted, who makes the NBA Finals and so on, still a very long way to go. But if that happens to be the head storyline going into the NBA Finals, no matter which 2 teams make it, it is going to be one of the best NBA Finals this league may have ever seen. And granted, we saw some very good NBA Finals over the past few years, but this could be a very exciting, entertaining one when you think about it in the big picture.
Yeah, and I think it's really good for the league too, because I feel like teams like Utah and Phoenix are proving these teams that think just because you get 2 superstars that, you're suddenly inevitable. You're proving them wrong. And I think that's great for the sport, because just having a couple of super teams, that's what the NBA, everybody who criticizes the NBA or doesn't like basketball and chooses baseball or football or soccer, for example, as their favorite sport, they criticize the fact that the NBA does not have parity, that you'll see, and it's not just this era either. Go back to the 80s. It was just the Celtics and Lakers. Then Jordan in the 90s. Then it was the Lakers with Kobe and Shaq. Then it was the LeBron era. Then it was the Warriors. Then it was LeBron again. Like it's this continued trend where you only have 4 or 5 super teams in the NBA, and these rosters try to build things up. The Heat, of course, set the precedent by bringing in LeBron and Chris Bosh at the same time to complement Dwayne Wade. And now everybody, after seeing the success that the Heat had, have tried to build these super teams. And I'd argue, other than that, and other than the Warriors bringing in KD, none of these other attempted super teams have really been a major success over these past 10 years. And there has been a lot of failures. Thinking about the Rockets with James Harden and Chris Paul. The Thunder never got further than making it to the NBA Finals when they had Westbrook, Durant, and James Harden all on their roster at the same time. It's a continued trend here. But that's why so many people criticize the sport of basketball. Thinking about hockey, you can get surprises there. You get a team like the St. Louis Blues 2 years ago that were the worst team for a while, don't have any big names, sneak into the playoffs, get some big upset victories, and win the Stanley Cup. In baseball, you can have a wild card team come through and make something happen. Think about Tampa Bay last year with their roster. There was no superstars in the Tampa Bay Rays. They just made things happy. They made things happen, and that was all because of that young core that they had grown over the years. They had suffered through some bad years. Just because there's no minor league system in the NBA like there is in baseball or hockey doesn't mean that a team can still go through a rebuilding phase and they can still go through a few years, use the draft to grow. And that's what Phoenix did, bringing in Devin Booker, DeAndre Ayton. They suffered through a few really bad years of Phoenix Suns basketball. The Utah Jazz, other than Gordon Hayward, they were a mediocre team at best for several years, but they picked wisely in the draft. Rudy Gobert, Donovan Mitchell, bring them both in. They've both been excellent additions. Denver, a similar thing after Carmelo Anthony left. That team was terrible. They get Jamal Murray, they get Nikola Jokic, and suddenly they're a contender. So I really appreciate how the NBA has sort of shifting the tide. And I feel like everything this postseason is sort of proving this. Just because a team has superstars doesn't mean they're going to find success. The Los Angeles Lakers, they're out of the playoffs. The Brooklyn Nets, Kyrie and KD played out of their mind in Game 3, but someone like Bruce Brown screws things over for them, and they lose the game. The Bucks are playing well. Giannis doesn't have any other superstars around him. He's got good players like Middleton and Drew Holiday, but he doesn't have any $200 million supermax players who are considered superstars, and he's finding success. Like, this is an incredible year for the sport that I think is going to help the NBA garner new fans and prove the doubters wrong that you can, in fact, rebuild and be successful. I think it's hysterical looking back at the NBA standings from 2015-16, just 5 years ago. The worst 4 teams in the Eastern Conference were the top 4 seeds this year: Brooklyn, Philly, Milwaukee, and the Knicks. The West was very similar. Other than the Clippers, who then had CP3 and Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, none of the 4 remaining teams made the playoffs that year. 7 of the 8 teams in the postseason this year had below 500 records in 2015-16. This is just proving that you can rebuild, you can use the draft. And like you alluded to, Tim, you can't just rely on making these acquisitions, bringing in a Kristaps Porzingis because he's a supposed star, because you need to pair them with someone. If you have a good solid core, if you have a deep bench, if you have players who can play and know their roles, you can find success in the NBA. I think the Toronto Raptors initially proved this 2 years ago by knocking down the Warriors. They did have Kawhi, but the rest of that team was a young core that had been together for years and had grown together and knew their roles, knew their place in the team, and found success with a young coach. And I think we're starting to see that even more, especially with Phoenix and Utah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You're starting to see a little bit of a transition here in the NBA. And I mean, again, you hit it right on the nose, Eddie. This is the simple fact that we've been stuck so long with the fact of the simple impact of a superstar player being on an NBA team. But when we had this little transition period, and of course, Brooklyn, I guess you could say, messed it up a little bit, making a big 3. When we talked about all this transition phase after this last offseason, for the first time this year, generally speaking, there was a balance in the NBA. There was no super teams. There was no over dominant force in which the game was pretty balanced. You have Kevin Durant, who left that Warriors team, comes over to Brooklyn. Granted, misses a full year hurt. Has Kyrie Irving. You're like, all right, it's down to duos. Same thing as well, for LeBron. He has Anthony Davis. There's a duo. But then, of course, Brooklyn turns around and tries to get everyone in the world, which, again, for the Nets, for the record, it's championship or bust. I don't blame them at this point. At the end of this year, everyone can opt out. And, a lot of Nets fans have said it. If you don't win, then you're never going to win. If you can't win now with this team may never get here again. You may never have a better chance in history of your team's franchise than you have right now. To have arguably the second best player in the NBA on your team, and I'm only putting him second behind LeBron, that is, of Kevin Durant. Having James Harden, who's one of the best pure shooters outside of Steph Curry, of course, in this league, in terms of scoring, that is, on your team is huge. And Blake Griffin, he stepped up to the occasion. I'll give him that too. He's done a very, very good job as well, stepping up here in the playoffs. Bruce Brown, though, should not be taking that shot. I don't know about that. But going back to the main point in terms of the transition, Eddie, again, I have to agree 100%. If you have a good team with good depth, and I'll point out Utah again for a second. Granted, I still don't understand his team's full success. When you turn around and you add more depth, remember this team traded for Jordan Clarkson and people were a little bit confused. Well, it all paid out. They found themselves a sixth man. Joe Ingles, who finally, thankfully, is not a starter on this team. Well, recently he has because of the injury to Mike Conley, but he's been used off the bench mostly as the seventh man. He's found ways to be successful and be more productive. And by the way, seeing a career year as a result of playing limited minutes. They turn around and they got Bogdanovich. Huge signing for that team. And they missed him last year during the pandemic. But the fact of the matter is, he's a big offensive piece and option that this team needed outside of Donovan Mitchell. Of course, they traded for Mike Conley 2 years ago, which was huge. And Mike hasn't fully, I would say, lived up to his potential yet. But he's still been a big enough factor for this team offensively that when he's mixed in there in that starting lineup, that team can find ways to be productive defensively as much as they even are offensively. And I think that the fact of the matter is this, staying at least with the teams that we have left in this playoff, Eddie, moving forward, again, I already talked about whoever makes the finals, that's going to be electric. But I think the key thing, too, that we're going to see for the first time in a long time, granted the Brooklyn Nets don't play some of the best offense we've seen while they play underwhelming defense. But whoever's going to win the championship this year is going to play some really, really astounding defense. Because you look at Utah, really, really strong defensively. But how about the Phoenix Suns? This team can play defense. In my opinion, they're one of the best defensive teams in the NBA. So I think that whoever makes it in the Western Conference in general is going to be very balanced overall on what their approach is in terms of being on the floor. And that's what the NBA has now today, which to me, in terms of going back to the point about transition, is massive. We're not just seeing teams that are dominant at scoring and that's it. Defense wins you championships. And when you have depth and you can play defense, you're going to be successful. And we're seeing that right now, at least in the Western Conference, of the two teams that are dominating, the Jazz and the Suns.
Yeah, and you can say it for the East too, that Bucks-Nets game, 86-83, you never see those scores anymore. But that game was really all about the defense from both of those teams, both of who had really struggled with defense and been criticized that their superstars didn't play enough defense, and they got the job done. But two more topics. I want to shift gears to something that we didn't get a chance to touch on last week, but it kind of drew a lot of attention about a week and a half ago. So Naomi Osaka, who, of course, four-time tennis major champion. She's been playing really well recently. And she's become one of the top tennis players on the women's circuit in the WTA, but ended up withdrawing from the French Open after just one round. She had first said that she was not going to do any media, any of the mandatory press conferences. She risked a fine. She wasn't willing to really take that on, and then she decided to straight up withdraw, and there's still uncertainty about whether she's going to play Wimbledon in a couple of weeks or play for Japan in the Tokyo Olympics, in their host Olympics in just 5 weeks' time. So, of course, there's a lot of drama with this, and a lot of people have been very quick to judge her one way or the other on this whole circumstance. Now, my position here is this. Of course, someone's mental health is really significant, and it comes well before actually playing. Their personal condition is important. And I feel like a lot of us fans, or us in the media as well, just tend to criticize athletes and kind of forget that they are also human beings just like us. And I feel like that's an issue that we see throughout society, where we'll see someone be overly critical of, say, a politician, for example, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or a teacher. And it's all because we're all people at the end of the day. They might be doing different things than us, but we all deal with the same experiences and the same problems, and we all have that universal human spirit. That being said, Naomi Osaka does also have to recognize, though, that as a professional tennis player, some of these obligations come with the stardom, and if she wants to be a big-time tennis player, become one of the celebrated tennis players on the female bracket, of course, over the last 20 years, a sport that has been dominated predominantly by the Williams sisters. But Naomi Osaka has really risen to fame, of course, played that infamous match with Serena Williams at the US Open 3 years ago, and was kind of seen a little bit by some as evil for beating Serena in that match, but has definitely risen, of course, has been a big advocate for racial justice over the past year as well, of her being African-American and Asian descent, two groups that have really dealt with a lot of injustice over the past year due to regarding a variation of circumstances. But all of that said, as a professional athlete, you have to know that with the stardom comes some sacrifices, and one of them is having to speak with the media and having to deal with that and having to face the tough questions, because when you're in the limelight like that and so many people are watching, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be intrusive and want to know information, and it's kind of dirty to think about it in some ways, but that's just sort of the name of the game, and that's sort of how things are. But I think some people were a little too quick to completely disregard her and her claims, but I don't know. I kind of toe the line and kind of on the fence on this. I'm curious in your opinion here, Tim.
Well, to be honest, I kind of side with Osaka a little bit. And what I mean by this is just watching her play tennis and watching her style overall and how she handles interviews and so on. To me, and I know this sounds maybe a little bit crazy, Eddie, but she reminds me a lot of, for example, a guy like Marshawn Lynch. And let me explain for a moment. Obviously, Marshawn's a very enjoyable, energetic character. But what I mean by that is she's as simple as this. Yes, I get I'll talk to you and so on in terms of the media, but I let my play do the talking. I let what I do on the court be the pure definition of the kind of person I am. I don't sit here and I talk about what I'm going to do. I show what I'm going to do. And I'm not saying that that's the reason why she shouldn't, have done media or shouldn't get, stuff for not wanting to do with media. But the fact of the matter is this. Listen, it happens to everyone. And I get, yes, being a professional athlete, you're going to get attention and people are going to want to talk to you. And it's a responsibility that you're going to have to face. But sometimes you also have to remember, too, that people are humans. And you mentioned already, Eddie, to that point, that, listen, just because someone is in a certain job title and their expectations are that they have to be above, beyond professional on a regular basis, to me is a little bit insane. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be professional, but what I mean by that is that expecting him to be perfect and at 100% and expecting him to be full functioning in a sport that, might I add, requires a lot of energy in terms of training for matches and so on. These players are doing so many things throughout the week. And I'm not saying, again, that's justified, but sometimes mentally you get to a situation where it's like, listen, I just don't want to do this. And unfortunately, in sports today, there's no option for you to cop out. Why? You get fined. You turn around, you get flack for it. I mean, think about it like this. How about NASCAR? A driver crashes. They have the option, and I'm not saying NASCAR is perfect, but NASCAR, at least the driver's upset, they have an opportunity to step away and not do an interview. How come in NASCAR, though, that's okay? Granted, again, different sports, so on. But how come that's okay? But a player after a baseball game, after a tough game, can't do the same thing? How come in the NBA, same thing as well? LeBron after a tough series, how come he can't do media? Granted, again, he's a superstar. I'm not denying that fact of the matter. But at the end of the day, people have their own feelings. People have their own thoughts, their own, their own way of handling and coping with things. And it is not easy to be an athlete today in the 21st century. So the fact of the matter is, for Osaka, she's a hardworking athlete that turns around and is trying to let her play speak. But while she's not going through some of the best times, and she just simply wants time to be herself and not have to deal full on with the full stresses, I don't see a problem with that, in my opinion. I don't think if someone feels that they cannot sit up there and answer questions, not because they don't want to, but just because they don't feel like they can take it with the stress level they're dealing with, players in that regard shouldn't be obligated to it. I'm not saying that players should pick if they want to talk to the media or not. I'm not saying that, and that they should have a full option, as again, it comes with being a professional athlete. But don't criticize her for simply saying, I just can't handle talking to the media, because mental health does come into a factor. And I think the fact of the matter is this, is that from a humanistic standpoint, you have to realize at some point the athlete's health comes first. So to sit there and throw fines, that first off, had she, not done it and followed through while playing, that's a little bit bothersome, because she's telling you right there and throwing a red flag right in front of your face that I have a problem. How can you help me? And it goes like that for all sports right now, where I feel like that's a little bit of a problem. But I think to completely judge her and say, oh, well, she's not, a good person because she didn't want to do media, that's just, to me, that's a massive, massive overreaction at the end of the day. And again, give her credit for withdrawing and believing in what she believes in. But I'll tell you what, for Naomi Osaka, listen, once she fully comes back, and I know at least everything's in question up for the next couple of weeks, but expect that little mental break to be a big one for her. And I think she'll come out and she'll play really, really strong within these next few matches.
Oh yeah, she's gonna feel much better and feel much more comfortable. And one last thing, just to sum this whole thing up on this subject, like I know there's some people who will sort of say, like, and sometimes I even feel this sometimes with athletes complaining, like, they have tons of wealth, they have the celebrity, they have the fame, they have the power. I mean, they shouldn't be complaining as much as, the ordinary Joe, who has to deal with much more in their life and much more uncertainty. And that's a valid point. I mean, you can make that argument, but at the same time, like Tim's saying, like, he can't completely disregard that the athlete does have stress on them. They do have a lot of pressure as well. They have a very busy life. They, whatever mistake they make, thinking about, once again, that ordinary Joe, a mistake that he makes, he might draw some criticism from a few people, but something that an athlete does on a big stage is going to draw way more criticism and therefore cause more stress to them. And being forced to talk about it to a reporter is going to make it even worse for them, blow a situation way out of proportion, and not allow them to, in the future, perform as well on that field or on that court or on that track. I think that's something to remember here. And I mean, and sometimes I'll admit it, like I don't necessarily agree with athletes, and I certainly don't feel like we should end up in a situation where every athlete decides to just Marshawn Lynch the media because, as a prospective, hopeful member of the sports media in the future, I kind of feel like that I deserve that type of respect from the athletes because we are giving them a platform to share and allow them to express themselves to other people and show the real truth so that people don't, draw assumptions and weird conclusions about them. But you have to sort of be able to balance things and be able to respect their own personal privacy. And once again, remember that they're just people just like you. But I'm going to wrap this up, kind of take a weird turn from this last topic, but a new sport technically is debuting tonight, the Superstar Racing Experience on CBS. First of all, on the network, primetime on a Saturday night is really cool that they're getting this exposure. It's only a 6-week schedule. It's unique cars running on short tracks and dirt tracks, largely undervalued tracks that typically don't host that much action aside from local events. And it starts at Stafford Speedway tonight. Also really excited that Alan Bestwick, a longtime NASCAR announcer, is going to be coming back to the racing scene. Matt Yoakum, by the way, I saw as the pit reporter. He's not working for Fox anymore. He was always my favorite of the pit reporters for NASCAR. But all the old faces are there. I was looking at Jeff Gluck, who's a reporter for motorsports. I was looking at his Twitter, and I saw a picture, and you had Brad Daugherty, Jeff Hammond, David Stremme. I mean, it's like an old timers event, and I think this is really cool for motorsports. First of all, IROC, of course, failed in the past, but that was fun. And I kind of wish I had kind of grown up in that generation to get to watch that, where you could see drivers from all different types of motorsports competing against one another. You have that here. You have guys with NASCAR backgrounds, IndyCar backgrounds, dirt racing backgrounds, other types of backgrounds, rallycross even, and they all get to race in this one event. Where could you have Elio Castroneves and Bill Elliott racing each other on a 6-week schedule for a championship? This is such a unique experience. You're going to have Haley Deegan at 19 years old in 2 of these races and a few 60-year-old drivers. This is really an unbelievable experience and really cool for motorsports. And as someone who has really enjoyed watching the big 3 over these past few years, where you get to see some of these old timers from the NBA still getting to play, even if it's in a little bit of a shortened, compact way on a short court, a short schedule. It's a similar idea right here with SRX. And I'm really excited to see how CBS broadcasts it, as well as how fun these 6 weeks are starting tonight at Stafford Speedway.
Yeah, I'll say this, since IROC's departure, and you asked the question, Eddie, of where else can you see something like this where you see guys, let's say from IndyCar or NASCAR or, other sports all meet and all collide. The only true instance, at least in the last 10 years, was maybe the Daytona 24. And that's it in terms of the Rolex 24 of different guys in different styles, different, aspects of motorsports all meeting together with the purpose in terms of a competitive event of course, winning the 24 hours at Daytona. But I will say this for SRX, that's the new thing. And to me, what I think just makes it so exciting, it's not the fact that we have old broadcasters that we love so much, but it's the fact that it's a bunch of different personalities in this field, which I think is, to me, the biggest part about this. If you want a series to be successful, you want everyone to enjoy it. Forget about the cars. SRX, by the way, really interactive with the fan. Give Ray Everham a lot of credit with how interactive he was with fans, trying to get fan feedback to try to find a series that fans would enjoy. Of course, they go to Stafford Speedway, which is a very, very good short track, and it's going to be energetic. And I look at this field. I mean, Paul Tracy. When's the last time you saw Paul Tracy race? I think this is going to be such a cool thing to see him on a track. Obviously, Elio coming right off an Indy 500 win. Fans are going to want to see him. I mean, Michael Waltrip. People want to see Michael Waltrip in a car. Granted, I hope he's not using any jet fuel. But at the end of the day, I'd love to see Michael Waltrip. And we finally get to see Greg Biffle in the 69. We've been waiting 5 years for something like that. SRX to me in general has a whole lot of excitement. And I also want to say this one last thing when we look into tonight. If anyone hasn't seen the SRX cars, I advise you do, because I'll tell you this, and I got to give SRX a lot of credit. When sponsorship came into the question and essentially the overall question of, well, how are we going to best display sponsors on our cars, considering our unique shape? You have to give them credit. Looking at some of these cars, yes, they're not what you see in NASCAR today, where they're all out and flamboyant and you can see and have your sponsors jump out. And for the record, for NASCAR, it's still a problem because they want to find ways to make cars jump out and look even better. But SRX has done a really good job displaying its sponsors. I mean, there's so many cars that just beautiful, beautiful sponsor holds that you can read. For example, Michael Waltrip's Progressive car. I think that looks really, really good, going into tonight. So I think that overall sponsorship can only get bigger for the SRX. But granted, tonight, this is going to be a good race. And I think that no matter who wins, I mean, it's really hard to pinpoint because, again, first race for everything. But this is just going to be an exciting event. And I expect fans to be watching and people, at the Speedway, essentially having the times of their lives, because this is simple, unique racing, fun racing. And again, all these legends all together, or all these different, drivers mixed with youth and so on, you're going to see some electric racing. And SRX, I feel like, Eddie, he's truthfully going to produce.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's a really good time to really bring a bunch of motorsports fans together, and it's going to be fun to watch it on CBS. A lot of fun action going on in sports, of course. Like I said, this will be the year anniversary of Sports Speak. We've really enjoyed getting to bring it to you, and we're gonna have a lot more fun coming up because I've got summer break. I'm gonna be graduating from high school on Tuesday, so I'm gonna have some more time to get some more content out, and we're gonna try to get some more guest interviews as well throughout the summer. But we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope you have a great rest of your weekend. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Signing off here on Sports Speak.